Most people, when they think of the Civil War, immediately think of it as a conflict between Cromwell and Charles I, but there was much more to it than that. It was a conflict which had a devastating impact across the British Isles. Few areas were untouched by the armies, which rampaged across the country, appropriating money and resources and leaving disease and destruction in their wake. As many as 1 in 5 adult males in England fought in one or other of the armies. A greater proportion of the population died as a result of the civil wars in Britain and Ireland than in both world wars. The civil wars impacted upon everyone, and all will have known someone who fought, who was injured, or who lost their lives in the fighting. But what were their stories? The Civil War Petitions Project has uncovered thousands of stories from the ordinary people who fought in and lived through the civil wars. These are stories of suffering, sacrifice, endurance, and survival.
The enemy stripped him of his clothes and took away all he had except his shirt, and would have cut his throat had not the woman of the house begged them on her knees to spare his life.
Petitioner, having no means to maintain her, and having 2 small children to maintain, is driven unto great necessity, and has been constrained to pawn and sell all that she has for the maintenance of herself and her poor children.
He was in Pendennis Castle when it was besieged, where he suffered great extremity, and did eat horseflesh for many days.
Petitioner's husband was slain, leaving your petitioner a poor, distressed widow. She, for many years since, with great labour and hardship, has got her living, so long as God gave her ability of body, but now, being grown aged and sickly, and is no way able to maintain herself.
Successive government regimes throughout the civil wars, interregnum, and restoration of the monarchy offered both regular pensions and one-off payments to their soldiers who had been wounded and the families of those who had died in their cause. In order to claim a pension, veterans and widows had to draw up a petition outlining their or their husband's military service, when and how the soldier had been injured or killed, and how disablement or bereavement had affected their subsequent life, especially the income needed to maintain themselves and family. Orphans were often represented by other relations or members of the community. Most petitioners were illiterate and required a scribe to help them write their petition. Scribes helped ensure that petitions were written according to the correct formula and included all the necessary deference to the authorities. The individualistic way in which the narratives of service were written suggests that scribes recorded this directly from the testimony of the petitioner. Claimants then presented their petitions and certificates to the court of quarter sessions in their home county. These courts were held 4 times a year and were presided over by the justices of the peace, with members of the public watching on. Petitioners would have to defend their stories, and veterans were often required to display their wounds in this public arena before the justices would decide whether to award them a pension.
In total, over 3,500 petitions and certificates and over 25,000 records of payments in the court order books have survived. The Civil War Petitions Project has digitised and transcribed all the surviving petitions and certificates. These images and transcriptions can be found on a freely accessible website, along with the records of payments from the court order books. By publishing these documents online, the stories of those ordinary people whose lives are impacted by the civil wars are available for all to hear. We have uncovered a richly textured picture of how women who were widowed as a result of the civil wars experienced the conflict. This was a crucial period in the history of war widowhood in England and Wales. The civil wars marked the first time that entitlement to a military pension was extended to the widows of those who died in service. After the legislation governing the pension scheme expired in 1679, it was not until 1901 that widows again would be allowed to claim military pensions from the state. Amongst the other discoveries unearthed by our project is the extraordinary level of medical care that was available to soldiers in the civil wars. The petitions often contain details of how casualties were treated by practitioners, And this has revealed how practitioners were highly capable, often successfully treating surprisingly difficult cases. The general standard of care provided by Civil War practitioners were comparable to those advocated in the published works of the foremost surgeons of the day, not only in England and Wales, but across Europe. Furthermore, the types of wounds survived by soldiers from the Civil Wars corresponds to data available from the Napoleonic Wars and even the First World War. The ways in which those who managed welfare systems responded to the enormous strains of supporting thousands of claimants, as well as the demands of government, also has a resonance for today. Finally, the number of petitions from Civil War veterans unearthed by the project, which date well into the 18th century, has been staggering. This reveals the previously overlooked extent to which stories from the Civil Wars were publicly recited for generations after the conflict ended. It is often assumed that the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 brought a welcome return to normality to a populace eager to forget the nightmare of the previous 2 decades. However, the anger, frustration, pride in one's service, and even nostalgia are apparent in the petitions, make it clear that contemporaries were not content to let bygones be bygones. The continual process of talking about wartime experiences in the public environment of the courts during the petitioning process would have reinvigorated wartime memories and circulated them to new audiences, especially the younger generation. The narratives of service and sacrifice, of navigating complex welfare systems, and the persistence of conflict memories found in the stories uncovered by the Civil War Petitions Project all have echoes to our present time. If we can learn something from these stories and use this to the benefit of our own society, then the sacrifices of the ordinary men, women and children who lived through the Civil Wars will not have been in vain.
Robert Ram, a parliamentarian army chaplain, proposed in 1644, "They that have received any hurt or loss by the wars ought to be liberally provided for, and comfortably maintained all their days by them that set them forth." Here we have a Puritan clergyman articulating the spirit of today's Armed Forces Covenant, 370 years before it was formulated. With the help of Britain's modern-day war widows and veterans with disabilities, we would like to investigate the similarities and differences between the 17th century pension scheme and the experience of state military welfare today. We would like to pose the question, is there anything that current practice might learn from the 17th century?